Good evening and welcome here to another forum at the Kennedy School. Perhaps no issue has been more divisive and yet times more uniting than that of religion and American politics. And we've had forums here in the past. Our speaker tonight joined a panel on this subject last spring. It was very enlightening and informative. Last year we had also had Rick Warren here, author of A Purpose-Driven Life, and he said something, just to put this in context as we gather. I've never been able to verify this absolutely, but I think it's close. He said that on any given weekend, more Americans go to church, synagogue, or mosque in the course of a weekend than all the Americans who go to all the sporting events over the course of an entire year. That gives you some sense of just how religious this country is, how, and in particular in recent years, how much more seriously people take their religion. And yet it has become a source of division in our politics. And even as we are preoccupied with Katrina and Rita and the other events around the world in Iraq and elsewhere, this issue of how we respond to the mix of religion and politics is so combustible that we dare not take our eyes off it. We must continue to explore and understand. And fortunately, in our speaker tonight, we have someone who I think can bring great enlightenment to this subject. I first met Jim Wallace back in the mid-1990s, shortly after, during the time that the welfare reform was passing. And you'll recall there were some members of this faculty who were distressed that the welfare bill did not provide sufficient funds in their judgment for welfare recipients, for transportation, for education, for child care, and the many other services they would need in order to go to work. I went up to a dinner that Jim Wallace organized. He was living up on 16th Street, working at a place called Sojourners up towards Adams Morgan. And it was a very poor area of town where he had located himself. And he was calling pastors in from around the country and others to figure out how to mobilize the faith sector to help and provide those services that government wasn't providing, to try to fill in those gaps. And he was throwing himself into the breach and trying to mobilize others. That's the spirit of the man, someone who has cared much more about unity and much more about social and moral renewal than many others. He comes to us as an evangelical, and in American parlance today, that's often seen as someone from the right. He is coming from a progressive position on the left. Just briefly, in addition to being a speaker, an author, an activist, an international commentator on ethics and public life, he was the founder of Sojourners, Christians for Justice and Peace, more than 30 years ago, and continues to serve as the editor of Sojourners magazine, which covers faith, politics, and culture. His most recent book, God's Politics, Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It, which was published in 2005, some months ago, continues to be near the top of the bestseller list. He speaks at over 200 events a year. His columns appear in many of our major newspapers. In the last several years, he's led more than 250 town meetings, bringing together pastors, civic and business leaders, and elected officials in the cause of social justice and moral politics. His call to renewal has hosted annual roundtables on poverty for national religious leaders and successful national summits. He is someone that President Bush has reached out to, asked him to come to the Oval Office, talk to him. And I'm not sure what they say in there. It'll be interesting to hear what that conversation is like. But we are fortunate this year as well that he is teaching a course on religion and politics at the Divinity School, and it's been a very attractive course to many here at the Kennedy School. And I urge you, if there's still time, to sign up for his class, because you're in for an adventure. We're in for an adventure tonight, and we are very appreciative, Jim Wallace, that you're here with us. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you, David. It's good to see you again. And thank all of you for coming out tonight on this very crucial topic of the relationship between religion and public life, or faith and politics. It's good to be back at the Kennedy School. I was a fellow here once, and I've taught here, and at this wonderful JFK Forum. This is one of the best town meeting sites I come to. I really enjoy being here. I know I'm among friends when I'm here, so thank you for coming. Today we started this class at the Divinity School, but it's got students from all over the university and around the city. And again, I was just amazed at the energy around this topic. 10 hands in the air when we finish the class. It's good that we got 12 weeks left. But we're just starting, and this is a topic whose time has come. My 7-year-old son, Luke, is good at sensing the national mood sometimes. And I remember before the election, he and I were working the streets of our Columbia Heights neighborhood, trick-or-treating. And Luke looked up at me and said, "Daddy, this election's more important than Halloween, isn't it?" Indeed it was. And it was one of those elections that no matter what the outcome, half the population, half of us, would have felt crushed at the outcome, no matter which way it went, and crushed at the point of our faith and even most basic moral values. Clearly, these are divisive issues, and religion played a major role in the election. Some didn't like the way it was used, and some would say abused this last time, and I think the election called us to a fundamental reassessment. Here's what I think happened. Many people watched the way that religion was used in the election, or they have seen the way it's been portrayed in the media for decades now, or they observe how it's invoked in the corridors of power, the White House and the Congress, and they stand back and they say to themselves, wait a minute, I'm a person of faith too, and that's not my faith. Do you feel that way? Or I care about moral values as well, and those are not my moral values, or at least not all of them. When HarperCollins moved up the publication of this book, God's Politics, 3 months to coincide with the State of the Union and the inaugural events, I got out on the road quickly after the election, and I began to meet these people all over the country. Those who felt left out and left behind, and we had virtually town meetings disguised as book signings all over America, and revivals in bookstores, it seemed. And as I listened and I learned in those town meetings, I began to understand that the configuration of faith and politics, the landscape of this issue, is really changing in America. And I want to talk to you about that tonight. I went to the East and the Midwest, the South, to Texas, to the Mountain States, California, the Pacific Northwest, and after a few weeks out, I realized something, and I began to announce this at a lot of forums, and I would say, I have an announcement to make tonight that might be encouraging to you. The announcement is this: I'm convinced now that the monologue of the religious right is finally over and a new dialogue has just begun. Some journalists call this the rise of the non-religious right, which isn't much of a name for a movement. But movement is the word I heard on people's lips across the nation. They weren't coming to just get a book signed, they were coming to join something, be a part of something. They wanted to have their voice heard too. So I thought tonight I would say a little bit about what I saw, what I learned. And part of it was who was coming. Now you might recognize yourself on the guest list here, because it's very diverse. One, I met a lot of evangelical Christians who don't feel represented by a handful of television preachers. They are moderate and they are progressive in their politics. And maybe in the question time I could tell you about the amazing story at Calvin College in Grand Rapids when the president came to do a commencement address this spring, and a whole different thing happened than anybody expected with those evangelicals. It was an amazing story. They're wanting their voice to be heard. Then there were Catholics who don't feel spoken for by a handful of bishops who this time said to them there was only one issue on which Catholics could vote in this election, which was abortion, and all the rest of Catholic social teaching got left behind. They didn't like that, and they were coming out. A lot of mainline Protestants came, the denominations, Methodist, Episcopal, and the rest, and they have felt, I think, to use my neighborhood language, dissed by the conversation, disrespected, as if they're not even people of faith, some would say. A lot of black Christians were coming because this has been a very white conversation in the media. When the media says evangelicals, they really mean white evangelicals. They don't mean the historic black churches, who often have a very different point of view. A lot of Latino, Asian Christians were coming who are changing the face of their churches, and a lot of rabbis were coming, and their congregations who loved to hear the tones of Micah, Isaiah, and Amos in regard to our priorities. I met a lot of young Muslims. Let me recommend the book, No God But God by Reza Aslan, how his Muslim faith is going through a battle for the soul of Islam, an internal battle. All the great monotheistic faiths have a battle going on within them, and he's fighting for a more tolerant, open, compassionate, even peaceful Islam. Lots and lots of young people would say, I'm spiritual, but not religious. Lots of them. They were all coming out. Even those who would say, I'm agnostic, I'm atheist, but I felt welcome tonight. Every time we had a meeting, I would say, religion has no monopoly on morality. There was a hunger for a new conversation about a moral discourse regarding our public life, a conversation I would say we all need and that we're all needed for. One of our first meetings was in Boston, down at Copley Square, with 1,000 people one day out in the middle of the day for a discussion. And a young man came up and said, to get his book signed, he said, now, I'm gay. Thank you for making me feel so welcome tonight. But you know what? It's easier to come out as gay in Boston than as religious in the Democratic Party. So we begin to have that conversation all the way around the country with Democrats. This was more, I think, than the religious left. In fact, I found people, they weren't saying, oh, I'm glad finally now there's a religious left. No, they were saying, I'm glad for the kind of religion that doesn't get squeezed into categories of left and right. I think the religious right was a creation of the political right. There were meetings. I could name the names of the political operatives and the preachers who showed up, and dates. And they made deals. Give us your lists. Give us your database. We'll turn our computers on them and create a power base, a constituency aimed for gaining political power. It worked. It was successful. I would suggest that to create something that's a mirror image of that on the left is a mistake. Utterly partisan, not accountable, not holding politics accountable, confusing ends and means, just aiming for power and winning and nothing else. I think it's a mistake. Religion is best when it is not ideologically predictable or loyally partisan. I think we have to have a new conversation. It isn't about just left or right or a mushy centrist middle, but to ask, where is the moral center of our public life? We don't go left or right, but go deeper to try and understand what are the moral values, issues at stake in any political conversation or policy discussion. I think Lincoln had it right. You don't say God is on your side, you worry and you pray earnestly that you be on God's side. The God on our side way leads to bad things in politics, like hubris and triumphalism and overconfidence and always bad foreign policy. The worrying, if we're on God's side, leads to things that we need in politics, like humility, accountability, and reflection. Lincoln had it right, And King did it best. Bible in one hand, Constitution in the other. Above all, I think religion is not meant to be a wedge that divides us, but a bridge that can bring us together on the biggest issues, the big things, as I'm now seeing a new convergence on the issue of the reduction of extreme poverty. I'm seeing, we were at the G8, we were in New York last week for the UN special session, had a convocation this spring in Washington, D.C. I'm seeing people from all across the spectrum, Rick Warren's joining, where faith is somehow bringing us together across all of our dividing lines on the really big issues. The subtitle of the book, Why the Right Gets It Wrong, the Left Doesn't Get It, is for me the heart of things. The right is very comfortable with the language of religion, faith, God, almost so much they sometimes act like they own the territory, maybe own God. But then they narrow everything to just one or two issues, as if there are only two moral values issues in American politics, abortion and gay marriage. I think those are important issues, and if you want to discuss that, I can tell you how on the road we found some really exciting common ground on even those tough, divisive, so-called hot-button issues. There is common ground to be built there, but these can't possibly be the only moral values issue. I am an evangelical Christian. I find 3,000 verses in the Bible about the poor, so I insist fighting poverty is a moral values issue too. And protecting the environment, who a number of young faith-inspired activists want to remind us could also be called God's creation. Fighting to protect that is a moral values issue too. And finally, my goodness, after 2,000 American lives and tens of thousands of Iraqis, whether you go to war and when you go to war and whether you tell the truth about going to war is a religious matter as well. When you're on a book tour, they put you on these TV shows, and some nights you have fun, some nights you don't. But I had fun on the night with Jon Stewart Daily Show. Some of you might watch Jon Stewart. John is a smart guy, he's a funny guy, but he's a serious guy. Came backstage before and he said, I knew he'd read the book, he was asking questions from the last few chapters, you know. He said, what's the relation between aid, trade, and debt in overcoming global poverty? Smart question. He said, I'm afraid I'm going to ask silly questions out there. I said, well, John, isn't that your job? The other, he says, now, Jim, you want to bring religion and the words of Jesus into politics? I could feel millions of his young audience saying, oh no, he's got some wacko evangelical preacher on my favorite, you're going to ruin my favorite show. I said, yeah, John, but I don't think Jesus' two top priorities would have been a capital gains tax reduction and the occupation of Iraq, you know? How did Jesus become pro-rich, pro-war, and only pro-American? When someone is stealing your faith in the public arena, it's just time to take it back. So John, we got going in this kind of Jewish Christian banter, and he asked a question. I said, good question, John. I said, you mean good question for a Jewish guy? I know we're not going to heaven, but can we have a neighborhood nearby? We'll keep it clean, you know? I said, John, the Hebrew prophets, used humor and satire and truth-telling to make their points. You do all three very well. Maybe, John, you're in the tradition of the biblical prophets. He says, oh, no. We had a great time. After his show, though, the emails came. Thousands. I was amazed by them. They said, I lost my faith because of television preachers and bad fundraising and pedophile priests, cover-up bishops. And some said White House theology. Or they said, amazingly enough, they said, I didn't know, this is amazing, I didn't know you could be a Christian and care about poverty. or the environment, or the war in Iraq. I didn't know. They had never heard anything but one version of all of these issues from religion, and they were very glad to hear there was another option. The left doesn't get it because they forget their own history. Every major, you know this, I think, every major social reform movement in our nation's history, abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, child labor law reform, and most famously civil rights, have been fueled and driven, at least in part, by religion, by faith. Where would we be if the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel or the Catholic activist Dorothy Day, if they just all kept their faith to themselves? Where would we be? We can do this in a way that is open, tolerant, democratic, and respectful of pluralism. I think the real issue is not whether we'll bring religion in the public life, but how. I believe in the separation of church and state. I don't think that means the segregation of moral values and the banishment of religious language from public discourse. How we do this is, I think, the critical thing. I think the biggest mistake progressives have made in the last several decades is to concede the entire territory of religion and values to a religious and political right and let them define this in the most narrow and partisan way possible. We must never make that mistake again. The reason I'm concerned about a good discussion about faith and politics is that we miss the power that faith can have in our public discourse. I was invited to speak a couple of years ago to a very different place than this great forum at Harvard or a great church or university or town meeting. The inmates at Sing Sing prison wrote and said, "Come and speak to us." It sounded interesting, so I wrote back and said, "Sure, when do you want me to come?" This young man, young prisoner, young brother wrote back and said, "Well," he said, "we're free most nights." He said, he was a real comedian. He said, we're kind of a captive audience here. He said, so the authorities were very generous and gave us a room down in the bowels of that infamous prison, Sing Sing, and left me alone in the room with 80 guys for about 5 hours. Amazing night. And one young man said during the course of that evening, something I'll never forget, he said, "You know, Jim, all of us here at Sing Sing, almost all of us, are from just about 5 neighborhoods in New York City. Just about 5 neighborhoods. It's like a train," he says. "It begins in my neighborhood. You get on that train when you're 9 or 10 years old, and that train ends up here at Sing Sing." He'd had a spiritual conversion inside the walls of that prison, and the New York Theological Seminary had a program, only one I know about, that trains masters of divinity inside the walls of the prison. You can be a preacher inside the joint, and you graduate when your sentence is up. He said to me, "When I get out," he said, "I want to go back and stop that train." 2 years later, I'm back in New York City at a town meeting, and guess who's up front, leading the meeting? This young brother, back home now, trying to stop that train. That's what I mean by a faith-based initiative. Faith is meant for the big things. There's one thing I want to get across tonight, it's this. Faith is meant to change the big things, things that you think can't be changed, that seem impossible, where the odds are against us. That's why they call it faith. Stopping fast-moving urban trains on their way to places, inevitable destinations, starting in only certain zip codes on their way to places like Sing Sing. That is a big thing. Here's a big thing. Almost 3 billion people living on less than $2 a day. Or a silent tsunami which takes the lives of 30,000 children every single day. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. In New York, at the G8, we had a gathering of all these relief and development organizations and churches and religious folks, and one of them did something that has stayed with me. He said, he's the leader of Christian Aid, one of the biggest ones in Britain. He said, 30,000 children every day is like 1 every 3 seconds. It's just like this, he said. And we all began to snap our fingers. 1 every 3 seconds until we change. The math is not difficult. Truth is, it would be relatively easy and relatively cheap to change those facts. Gordon Brown, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who'll be Prime Minister soon, he met with us and he said, you know, for the first time we have the information, the technology, the knowledge, the capacity to end extreme poverty as we know it. We don't have, he said, the moral and political will. That's your job, he said, looking at the religious leaders. Faith is meant to change the big things. I am a 19th century evangelical, born in the wrong century. In the 19th century, evangelicals were revivalists and abolitionists. They were evangelists and reformers. They helped lead the anti-slavery campaign. They fought for women's suffrage, for child labor law reform. Charles Finney, the Billy Graham of his day, was the one who invented the altar call. Do you know why? Finney wanted to get the names and addresses of his converts to sign them up for the anti-slavery campaign. That's why we first had an altar call. I think a new altar call is emerging around the world among a new generation of faith-inspired activists. I meet them all over the world. Half our staff's under 30. We have senior staff that are not even 30 yet. And I'm finding a whole generation for whom poverty is going to become the new altar call. Poverty is the new slavery, imprisoning minds and hearts and lives. There's a power to change this. The Bible says if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move a mountain. We have some mountains to move. As long as we're in this left-right polarization and fighting over a couple issues, we'll miss the chance to move a mountain. But that's what I see happening now. On the book tour, I was seeing younger and younger people coming out. I expected college students, but then they kept looking younger and younger. And I said to this kid at the table, I said, you in school? Yep. Where? High school. What year? Freshman. Mom and Dad weren't there, just he and his friends. Then 14, 13, Minneapolis. A little girl standing there at the table. I look up and she smiles. I said, how old are you? She says, 11. 11. What did you get from the night? She said, well, I think we're just going to have to change the world. And who's going to do that? Well, I think probably people like me. So I told her story in Tacoma, Washington the next night. And I look up, here's a tinier little girl. And I look up, she grins, 9! I told her story in Seattle the next night. And here's the smallest one of all. I look up, she says, I think I'm the youngest so far. Really? How old are you? Well, I'm 8. And I just stopped the line. I said, what made sense to you tonight? She said, well, you talked about that everyday tsunami that's killing all the children. I was sitting there thinking, if I'm a Christian, I better do something about that. She's in the 3rd grade. I was at Harvard the next week over at the Div School talking to some of my students, and I said, if you all want to be leaders in this movement, you better get going fast because a whole generation is coming in behind you and going to push you out of the way. I believe, and I want to finish with this, I believe that what changes history are social movements. This place is a constant conversation about politics. I love that conversation. But I want to tell you, Lyndon Johnson didn't become a civil rights leader until Martin Luther King Jr. made him one. Movements change politics and change politicians. The best movements are the ones that have a social or a spirit. The best movements are the ones that have a spiritual foundation, always. I think this can be done in a way that is open and supportive of a democratic, pluralistic, diverse country. There are more Muslims now than Presbyterians in America. Don't tell the Presbyterians, but it's true. We've got to have a different conversation now, but I think the critical issue is a choice that we have to make, and I'll end with this. It's a choice between, the big choice, I think, in our time, is between cynicism and hope. That's the big choice. A word for the cynics. Cynics, you know, I like the cynics because they see the world as it is. No rose-colored glasses. They see it and they're against all the bad stuff. But they don't think it could ever change. Or maybe they tried for a while to change it. They got out there and they got disappointed. They got disillusioned. And after a while they felt kind of vulnerable being out there by themselves. So they retreated to a place called cynicism, where you're still against all the bad stuff, but you don't think it could change, and you decide to take your own security more seriously. Cynicism is a buffer against commitment. Hope, on the other hand, isn't a feeling or a personality trait or a state of mind. Hope is a decision. It's a choice you make because of something called faith. My Bible says hope is, or faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, or my best paraphrase is, hope means believing in spite of the evidence, and then watching the evidence change. Faith-inspired movements have changed big things. They have moved mountains. They have done it before, and they can do it again. David knows a lot of political leaders in Washington, D.C., and we know some who are deeply principled and are people of conviction. But you know, they do tend to walk around the Capitol with their fingers up in the air, and sometimes their wet fingers from doing this quite often. See which way the wind is blowing. We make the mistake of thinking you can change a nation by replacing one wet-fingered politician with another. The practitioners of great social movements like King and Gandhi understood you don't change a nation by just replacing one wet-fingered pol with the other. You change a nation when you change the wind. When you change the wind, it's amazing how quickly politics responds. I think the role of faith is not to be a wedge and a divider, but is to be a wind changer. Sometimes it takes a natural disaster to reveal our social disasters. Katrina has done that. Maybe the waters will wash away more than lives and cities and property, but maybe they'll wash away our public denial of how many people really are poor in this country, about the persistent connection between race and poverty in America, and maybe even those ideologies and misguided priorities that have so undermined the common good and left so many people alone. Those left behind in New Orleans had already been left out in America. It's time for a changing of the wind. It's a teachable moment that needs good teachers. I think the community of faith across our spectrum could be among those teachers, because finally, we're the ones who can say, faith is for the big things. We've done it before, we can do it again. And hope means believing in spite of the evidence, and then just watching the evidence change. Thank you very much.
Jim, thank you. We're going to go to questions. We have about a half an hour, so it'll be a good exchange, a chance for an exchange, especially if the questions are short, and end with a question mark in our tradition here at the Kennedy School. So we're going to go, we have microphones here. There are 4 microphones in all. We'll start this direction, Jim has obviously accomplished this. I'm going to hover in the background. You have the first question, sir, and then we'll come to you.
My name is Herbert Suda. I'm at the medical school. I'd just like to say I very much enjoyed your comments, but I would be interested to know if you could comment on the attitude and the role of truth by the religious groups. The reason I ask this is that I would like to know how it is that people who claim to be concerned about truth can be anti-science and can be anxious to have the non-scientific material presented, which is religious, presented to our school children.
Well, this is a big topic. A court case is pending. This is an aside. I'm always curious how those who are against the teaching of evolution in our schools, when it comes to social policy, are such social Darwinists. It becomes survival of the fittest. In class today, we had a very vigorous discussion about this very issue. And I talked about how that people are justly, rightly afraid of religious people who want to claim their truth and then sort of ram that truth down the rest of our throats like legislating Leviticus, I suppose. And I said, you know, the wrong way to do it is to say, I am a person of faith. I'm a Christian in a Judeo-Christian country. They always say Judeo-Christian, what they mean is Christian, but they say Judeo-Christian. And I get to win because I'm religious. I don't think King did that. I think we have to be disciplined by democracy. Religion must be disciplined by democracy, meaning when we get to the public square, we come with our religious convictions or moral convictions or whatever it is, but then we take, Brother Brian here says it well, you take a moral turn in the public square, and you have to then win the debate. King had this vision of a beloved community, but then he had to win a debate that a civil rights law in 64, voting rights 65 was good for all of us, not just the religious people. He spoke as a Baptist minister about his truth, but he had to convince the rest of us that this was the best thing for the common good. So we can come with our truth claims, that's part of what we all do, but then we have to be disciplined by democratic discourse. And if we want to change something, we have to win the debate. And I think people in this country are going to care what science thinks and says about any issue that we're talking about. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mark Linton. I'm a second-year student in the MPP program here. Thanks for coming. It's nice to have you back again. I wanted to ask you, tonight a lot of the examples we've talked about in certain issues, poverty being mentioned in the Bible a lot, a new wave of environmental activism, global poverty, and even the evolution example, they still in our current political framework tend to move toward the democratic or so-called liberal or progressive political stances, or at least they would be adopted in more of a democratic platform. So I wondered if you could just sort of help stretch our political imagination a little bit and talk a little bit more about what it would mean to have a progressive agenda while still avoiding that development of a political or a religious left that you were admonishing against at the beginning of your talk.
I had a conversation a couple months back with Howard Dean about all these things, and he wanted to discuss religion and politics, and we did. And he said, well, poverty, that's one of our issues. I said, no, it's not. I said, Democrats haven't led on poverty in years. You know, we have collectively failed the poor, Republicans and Democrats. And I think we've got to move to a place where, in fact, overcoming poverty becomes a bipartisan issue and a nonpartisan cause. Now, that's not just rhetoric for me. Right now, I think there are two obstacles to dealing with poverty, seriously. One is, we'll call the priority question. The poor just aren't a priority, aren't on the list even. Not the top, they're not even on the list. That could change with Katrina. The other is a big debate about strategy, where a conservative side talks about culture and a liberal side talks about policy. And I think we need some kind of a new alliance where liberals are talking about issues of strengthening family and out-of-wedlock births and issues of personal responsibility, and conservatives are talking about strategic investments in education, housing, healthcare, and the like. There's got to be a new conversation that is disciplined by results and not what's liberal, conservative, what's right and what works on the street. And the truth is that we won't overcome poverty without measures of both personal and social responsibility. Those two woven together become like the Catholic notion of the common good. So I think Katrina can't just enable one side to impose its agenda as if nothing happened. We need a whole new alliance on strategy as well as changing the issue of priority. So I think that won't look like just the left or the right. It'll take some of the insights and concerns of both sides and transcend maybe all of our failed approaches so far that we need to confess and move on.
Great. Thank you.
Please.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth Conlisk. I'm in the mid-career program here, and I was just curious as to what you thought the role of the media has been in this conversation. And, you know, I heard you talk a little bit ago about cynics and cynicism, and I was just wondering, you know, how you would characterize the media and how it's covered this conversation.
You know, at its worst, and David knows as well, Washington, both sides, they take an issue and they want to do two things. They want to first make us afraid of it, then blame it on the other side. Then take a poll to see who won. The election is just the last poll. They never get back around to trying to solve the problem. And the media, for its part, suggests that every issue has only two sides. Did you know that all of our issues have just two sides? When they do the pre-interviews for the TV shows, you know this well, they're auditioning you to see if there's enough conflict between the talking heads to make for good television. They're not worried about solving the issues either. So we have a politics, officially politics and media, the politics of fear and politics of blame. I think the American people are hungry for a politics of solutions and a politics of hope. And I think the media could serve such a critical role as the town meeting place, the sort of venue where we have this conversation. Take an issue I care about a lot, youth violence. There's not just two sides. There are multiple angles of sight you need to get your hands around it, multiple stakeholders, multiple constituencies you have to engage, and solutions both on the personal and social side that defy the categories of left and right. So I think the media has to be held accountable too. I do think they're beginning to see that there's more than one voice on the religious side. Now you're seeing more of a conversation. I defend the religious rights point of view, to have a point of view. I just want them to be not the only point of view. And so when the media has this conversation, they now could have a dialogue, and they're beginning to have that conversation more broadly. But the media has to be a place where we have a genuine town meeting about what the solutions are to the issues that we confront. And that'll take some confrontation, I think, on our part.
Thank you.
Hello, sir. How are you? My name is Joy. I'd like to thank you for coming. I attended Christian schools and also went to a Christian college, and sometimes when I speak to my friends, I have a really hard time. You know, you were discussing the issue of poverty, and a lot of people have the attitude, well, you know, God helps those who helps themselves, and you know, they're not taking God's blessings, and they really feel like things like abortion and homosexuality are important things, because if we change those things, then God will bless our country. So how can we have conversations that are respectful? And I was wondering if you could maybe give a few pointers for, you know, discussions along those lines.
There's a real difference in the conversations occurring among evangelicals around cross-generational lines. Under 30, at places like Wheaton College, Westmont College, Calvin College, it's a very different discussion than it has been for a long time. I see a whole new generation of faith-inspired sort of evangelical Christians who care more about poverty than about debating civil unions or gay civil marriage. Those issues are very important to them as well, but even there we're finding some common ground. I went to the Fulkerson's family Do you know Focus on the Family? James Dobson, Colorado, the sort of place where a lot of the gay marriage stuff is incubated. And, gay marriage became a surrogate in the last election for caring about the family. That's what it became. I think it's the wrong surrogate. When I say around the country that parenting in America has become a counter-cultural activity, all parents nod their heads, liberal or conservative. The issue is parenting and the raising of our kids. So I said in Colorado, I agree with you. These are James Dobson's policy people. I agree with you that family breakdown is a critical issue. In fact, it's a crisis. In fact, it affects more than poor kids. It affects kids at every class level of society. My neighborhood is 80% single-parent families. You can't overcome poverty with 80% single-parent families. You got to reweave the bond of family and community. But I said, explain to me how that gay and lesbian people are responsible for the breakup of the family. After an hour and a half, they conceded the point. They said, okay, family breakdown is due much more to heterosexual dysfunction than gay and lesbians. But, they said, we can't vouch for our fundraising department, you see. So I think we have to really dig deeper here on the issue of abortion. I think the starting point has to be, pro-life and pro-choice people could come together with a serious agenda to dramatically reduce the number of abortions and unwanted pregnancies in America and make a difference on that issue if we ever really got serious about it. And so I think there are ways to diffuse those hot-button issues and find some common ground and then turn to these other matters which are bringing people together. At a Christian college, the best thing I do is do Bible study. There are 3,000 verses about the poor in the Bible, maybe 12 or 15 on homosexuality, and those are quite a mixed bag of how they're interpreted. It's hard to misinterpret what the Bible says about our responsibilities to those whom the Torah calls the other and Jesus called the least of these. So I think that conversation is changing at places like Christian colleges. I think we're back here, yeah.
My name is Shovik. I'm a MPP1. Interfaith rhetoric often will list churches, synagogues, and mosques, but one of the missing words are temples. And with growing numbers of Buddhists and Hindus, there aren't really much references to Eastern religions, except occasional references to Gandhi. I was wondering what obstacles you thought Eastern religions, since they're not as dogmatic, as organized, and even not necessarily monotheistic, what obstacles they'd face in entering the religious dialogue in America.
At the National Cathedral this June, we had this big convocation on hunger and poverty, and we had all the Christian churches, the evangelicals and the liberals, which I always think is like the National Association of Evangelicals and National Council of Churches. It's like the Crips and the Bloods, being at the table. And I've done gang truce stuff, and that's how I learned how to relate to religious people, because Crips and Bloods and Vice Lords and Gangster Disciples, getting them together in truce was easier than getting all these church folks here. But we had them together. I like to have a Mennonite on hand to sit between them in case something happens. But we had them. Plus, we had, we had rabbis, imams, and for the first time, we had Buddhist leaders and Sikhs, and it was not just the sort of the monotheistic religion, but the East was there in a new way in collaboration. To me, that was a sign of good things to come. Billy Graham was here, I remember, a few years ago, and he was challenged by somebody who said, what about the Buddhists? I mean, they don't accept Jesus, and what's going to happen to them? And in a very statesmanlike manner, Billy said, well, I've been to many Buddhist countries, and they're a very gentle people, and frankly, I wish that we were as Christ-like as many of those Buddhists are, So I think, coming from the premier evangelist in the world, that was a very, so I think I'm finding more conversation. Almost every town meeting we had, there were Buddhists, almost every single one, and their voice is now, I think, beginning to be heard. Back up here.
Faculty at the medical school. I'm Patrick Whalen. I think many of us have wondered why now? Why all of a sudden has religion seemed to capture the stage in the political arena? And I've wondered if it isn't because in the past politicians were afraid to claim the Christian mantle when the fundamental reality of Christianity is nonviolence. And it's clear that statesmen have to, at least feel they have to be violent sometimes. But I'm sure you're familiar with this new Pew poll that suggests that the most faithful churchgoers are also the greatest supporters of the war in Iraq. And for many of us, this sort of suggests this fundamental riding off the rails of American Christianity. And I just wonder, how do you respond to somebody who feels that they can carry the mantle of Christianity while at the same time supporting violence as a means of conflict resolution?
People ask, why now is this question coming to the fore? Part of it is, it's become a part of politics and elections and all the rest. Part of it is, I think, though, that many of the issues we confront are at root, they do have moral and spiritual dimensions, and there's choices to be made that are more than just political choices. And I think that's beginning to inform a lot of these discussions. One of them is war and peace. There's a whole section in the book about that and how people are coming together across the spectrum again to raise, here's just some facts the media didn't report. Most every church body in the world that spoke on the issue of Iraq, with the exception of the American Southern Baptists, worldwide, decided this war in Iraq was not a just war. It didn't fit the criteria of a just war. You know the criteria, last resort, and all the rest. And most evangelical Christians around the world, including in the UK, Australia, Canada, all of our partners, they didn't support the war in Iraq and still don't. That story didn't get told very much in this country, but it was true. My wife is English, and she's a priest, the Church of England, and she just sometimes is amazed. She says, don't they know that God bless America isn't found anywhere in the Bible? We do have the kind of theology which confuses hymnology and scripture too often in the highest circles of power, and puts them at the service of what is, in fact, a very nationalist agenda. And so a number of thoughtful theologians, even those who admit the use of force under certain rigorous criteria, came to the conclusion that Iraq was not one of those times and places. And so that conversation was happening around the world, but it wasn't happening here the way it might have done so. Tony Blair met with a number of us before the run of the war in Iraq. We had a very good conversation, more than an hour, theology, moral politics, all the rest. He didn't end up agreeing with us, but it was a serious moral discourse. I was disappointed the president didn't meet with any of us that he met with on poverty issues to have a discussion about the war in Iraq from a religious point of view, and I think we've lost something from that lack of reflection. So I do think there's a growing, and this is not about pacifism versus just war, those old doctrines. There's a new synthesis emerging, you might call it just peacemaking, where conflict resolution becomes a central religious priority. People who are not just pontificating high above the struggle about the rights and wrongs of violence, they're in the middle, they're in Darfur, they're on the ground, on the street, trying to, with their bodies and their gifts and their energy. I know good friends who are in the middle of these conflicts trying to resolve them, and that maybe is the best response of all, to demonstrate that if nonviolence can be questioned as to its effectiveness, so can the policy of endless war as to its effectiveness in accomplishing the same goals that it says it can accomplish. Yes, please.
I come from Australia, and what you were saying before was fairly accurate. We're fairly similar to the United States in almost every respect, except our level of religiousness. Church attendance is much lower in Australia. We could be described as a nation of cynics. And I resonated with what you were saying about cynicism. How do you avoid cynicism, though, if there's that underlying philosophical question of what sort of God would allow poverty in the first place, would allow, Katrina in the first place? That kind of argument I find often very difficult to counter.
You know, for whatever reason, I've never had much of a struggle with that on the poverty question. I mean, there's a sort of biblical notion of economy, which is as simple as this: there is enough if we share it. Poverty is by and large human caused. It's exacerbated by disasters and the rest, but it's hard for me to blame God for what we've done to each other. My notion of God in this, Jürgen Moltmann talked about a crucified God, the suffering God, the God who weeps the most, broken-hearted God after Katrina, weeps more than any of us do. Katrina, these natural disasters, again, it's hard for me to pin that on the Almighty. What they tend to do is to reveal, again, they tear the curtain away. Katrina showed us what was under the rock in America. And those of us that have been living and working under the rock have been trying for years to get the media they're covering poverty now in the media. It's amazing. I've heard major reporters on Chris Matthews or Tim Russell say, we didn't know there were so many poor people in America. I mean, I'm not sure where they have been, but they finally discovered the fact of what we saw on the rooftops of New Orleans. So it's hard for me to blame. I know people struggle with this. For me, at least, blaming God for all this never made much sense when the causes of it seem a lot closer to home, at least to me.
Good evening. My name is Richard. I've really enjoyed reading your pieces over the last couple of years. But I have a question about part of your central thesis that the left just doesn't get it. As a lifelong progressive, activist, gay Democrat, the grandson of Scandinavian Lutheran ministers, and an atheist, why was it our concern to worry about who was trying to seek the higher moral ground in the churches? And the second part of the question is, where were all the progressive religious people since Jimmy Carter, since this really began? Where were they? Why was it our fight? And where were the progressive religious people? And since I've been standing a long time, I'm going to take your question, the answer to your question as I sit down.
In class today, some students asked about how the religious right has so controlled the conversation, and isn't that the way it always is with religion? And I just reminded them of the history, that the movement just before the religious right that made an impact on politics, the faith-inspired movement, was the civil rights movement, was led by black churches at the heart of it. And the South African struggle and victory could not have been understood apart from the role of Desmond Tutu and Frank Chikane and a whole movement, and Nelson Mandela was the first to say that. And all around the world we see other examples of religion put at the service of justice and peace and all the rest. So we have been skewed in our perception of that when it's now come from the right. So I think, when, as I said before, there's nothing wrong with being secular. This conversation is for all of us, religious or not. But the two battles I have are with the religious fundamentalists on the one hand and the secular fundamentalists on the other hand. Secular fundamentalists are not just secular or irreligious, they are disdainful and disrespectful of faith and religion and people of faith, and they make people of faith feel very disrespected, and it turns people away. And I think they forget their own history on the progressive side, and I think they really can be as intolerant in terms of their rejection. I mean, I got beat up both at the Heritage Foundation a couple months ago and 2 weeks later at the Campaign for America's Future, where I preached at the end, spoke at the end, and the next speaker got up and said, we don't want any kind of religion to shape our politics. Religious right or progressive religion, we don't want any kind of religion. And Jim wants to sell out on abortion. all I called for was a reduction in the abortion rate. And Jim's in favor of the faith-based initiative, which means he wants to hang on a shingle in every church that says no Jews or gays need apply, only white Aryan men. And I'm sitting there thinking, where in the world is this coming from? And I had an encounter on the right with the same kind of caricature and demonizing. So it's this sort of this polarity that I think prevents us from finding the common ground that I think is there. It's all around the country. I do think the country is more purple than red and blue. That's my experience. And I think religion could be a bridge to bring us together and not the wedge to divide us. But that means we have to transcend, move beyond these extremes of both sides. Please. Oh, back up.
The signals come, unfortunately, we only have time for this last question.
Okay, and then I'll get.
Does this work? Yeah. My name is Helene Thayer. I've been working on voting rights for the past year and a half. But prior to that, I was particularly interested in environmental issues. And that's part of why I'm working on voting rights, because public policy is so important and voting, determines that to a large extent. But what I would like to know, because you did mention the environment, how can we reach out to the Christians and stimulate Christian activism toward environmental benefit? To preserve God's world, which is so beautiful, and we've been so lucky in our generation that we actually could appreciate it. There must be a way. How can we do it?
There's a little booklet I'd like to commend to all of you. It's by the National Association of Evangelicals. Their new statement called The Health of the Nations, in which they have a whole section on the environment. So the media perception of the NAE is here, people who care just about abortion, gay marriage, but it's about human rights and Sudan and sex trafficking and poverty and the environment. So New York Times, an article Laurie Goodstein did about this, about a statement made by Rich Cizik of the NAE, in which he called global warming a religious issue. And I want to tell you that the global warming constituency in Washington, D.C. hadn't been on the radar screen at all because most of them aren't in the constituency of the present administration. When the NAE made that statement, the call from the White House came the same day. And it said, what about our policy don't you like? And it changed the whole dynamic of that issue in one day in Washington, D.C. Rich Cizik, who was a supporter of the president in lots of ways, in New York at Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza last week, we had this gathering of religious leaders, said, in fact, he said, the global warming policy, and you get in this Sunday on this week, the global policy of this administration, he said, is an embarrassment to many of us as evangelical Christians. Now, that was an astounding thing for someone from that sector to say, which just makes the point that this whole conversation about faith and politics is very fluid. It's changing quickly. I was on the Lehrer NewsHour after the election with Rick Warren. He was on to represent the point of view that said there were two issues that we were concerned about in the election: gay marriage and abortion. I was on to represent another point of view that said there were other issues. When I began to speak about poverty, Warren interrupted and said, I agree with that. The Bible's full of that concern. And when he was here, he probably talked about poverty. It's this epiphany he and many others are having. So there's a whole new conversation going on that I'm very encouraged about. I think it could bring us together as never before. Let me share with you a quick story to finish with. And it's back to this hope question, because I think that's critical. Taking the right position on the right issues doesn't change things. I want to leave you with almost a commission, if you will, from a young friend of mine whose name was Lisa Sullivan. Young African-American kid from my streets, my neighborhood, D.C., very smart kid, went to Yale, got a PhD. And when you're young, black, and female with a PhD, you can write your ticket. And she came back to the streets, where the kids on the streets had won her heart, and she became the best street organizer I'd ever met. She used rap, hip-hop, she loved, she scolded, she confronted, she organized. She, as they say in the our nonprofit world. She did capacity building. She was a star. She was the future. But I got a call one day that Lisa's big heart, and it was a big heart, had a heart ailment nobody had known about, especially Lisa. And within 2-3 weeks, Lisa Sullivan, not yet 40 years old, had died. Marion Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund and I held each other at her graveside, Lisa's graveside, weeping because Lisa was the future. Lisa leaves us with a commission that I want to leave you with tonight because it's kind of captured my heart, maybe it'll touch yours. Lisa used to say something when people would say to her things like, Lisa, the problem is just too big. The streets, the drugs, the violence, the apathy, the corruption, it's too big, and we're too small. Our staff, our budget, our resources, our faith. It's too big, we're too small. And Lisa, we don't have any Martin Luther King Jr.'s anymore. We don't have any leaders anymore. It's too big, we're too small, we don't have any leaders anymore. And Lisa would say these words. She would say, don't you understand? Don't you understand? We are the ones that we have been waiting for. We are the ones that we have been waiting for. We are the leaders that we have been waiting for. When only a critical minority of people grasp that kind of vision, it has changed things in this country and around the world. That's what I mean by faith. The kind of faith that changes the big things. And this polarized debate has robbed us of that kind of energy and power and dynamism, mobilizing, catalyzing potential to rouse the nation to its best self and change the things that we have to change. I think we can do that again because we are the ones that we have been waiting for. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim Wallace. Come back to see us. Good night.